Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first of two mini lectures on culture for the week. And in this mini lecture, we are going to be focusing in on one especially well-researched and especially important dimension of culture, which is collectivism versus individualism. And the importance of this construct in cultural psychology really started with this guy named Harry Triandis in the late 1980s. And Harry Triandis was one of the first people to try to intensively, rigorously measure individualism and collectivism across different cultures. And here's Harry Triandis's brief definition of individualism versus collectivism. Dr. Triandis says that in individualist cultures, most people's social behavior is largely determined by personal goals, personal attitudes, and personal values. Whereas in collectivist cultures, most people's social behavior is largely determined by goals, attitudes, and values that are shared with some kind of collective, whether it be your family, whether it be your tribe or village or organization, or your entire country. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail. Other psychologists building on Triandis's legacy have identified how collectivist cultures place a high value on things like maintaining relationships with others, emphasizing similarities rather than differences with others, so not trying to stick out from the crowd, not trying to demonstrate uniqueness, adjusting yourself to others' expectations and to the environment around you rather than trying to adjust the environment or others to meet your needs. And rooting yourself, really kind of being anchored to long-lasting networks and long-lasting traditions. And in your interactions with other people, respecting rank, being highly aware of rank, and the fact that you are at a position in a hierarchy. And you can contrast all of this with the values espoused by individualism. And individualist cultures place a higher value on maintaining a separate sense of self rather than a relational sense of self. On emphasizing uniqueness, so really digging into how people are different from one another and wanting to embrace that individuality. Instead of trying to adjust to others and adjust to circumstances, trying to reshape the environment and reshape others to meet your needs. Making free choices that are not necessarily deeply rooted in traditions or responsibilities to groups. And emphasizing that each person sort of has equal value rather than focusing on hierarchy and focusing on responsibilities according to your position and ranking in a hierarchy. So to sum all of that up, we think of these collectivist countries and collectivist cultures as emphasizing relationality rather than individuality, similarity rather than uniqueness, adjusting to people and circumstances rather than reshaping or influencing people and circumstances, being rooted in long-lasting traditions rather than making free choices, and emphasizing rank rather than emphasizing equality or egalitarianism. And so this graphic shows statistics from one particular data set that includes individualism and collectivism data on not all the countries across the globe, but many of them. And what you can see here is that countries that score especially highly on individualism are in the warmer red and orange colors. Countries that are especially high on collectivism are in the deep blue or green colors. And we really see sort of an east versus west distinction and a global north versus global south distinction. So countries that tend to be higher on individualism include North America, other English-speaking countries that are formerly colonies of the UK, including England, including Canada, including Australia and New Zealand, as well as especially Northwestern Europe. Those are our hot spots for individualism. Our hot spots for collectivism include some East Asian countries, some places in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and South America. Often, across lots of different types of ways of measuring individualism, lots of different data sets, the United States comes out as the absolute #1 most individualistic country in the world, even beating out, for instance, Australia or Canada or the UK or Scandinavia. So just think about that and how that might have influenced your psychology. If you're somebody who's lived in the United States your entire life, you have received one of the most individualistic set of psychological inputs, psychological influences possible across the entire globe. So in many ways, your psychology is likely to be pretty extreme compared to a global norm. However, what's interesting, given these nuanced and complex patterns that we see across countries, across continents, is that a lot of research on collectivism divides it down to a pure East versus West distinction. And when we're talking East and West, it might be as simple as US versus China, or the UK versus Japan. Occasionally also using data sets collected in Europe, occasionally also using data sets collected in South Asia. But essentially what this is doing is sort of taking a global map and going, this doesn't matter. Oh, we don't really care about Africa. All right, let's completely ignore the psychology of, let's say, East Europe or South Asia. And so this is really unfortunate. And I want you to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the lecture. We are missing data. We are looking at studies often that are treating individualism, collectivism as though it is synonymous with the distinction between the US and China, or the UK and Japan. We are going to be missing nuances that have to do with the whole rest of the globe. So our perspective is necessarily limited. And just keep that in mind as a caveat. One other nuance here that really limits our discussion of individualism and collectivism is this is not just a country-by-country difference, of course. Collectivism doesn't just vary across nations, it also varies within them. And one of the people who's done the best work in exploring these nuances is a woman named Hazel Marcus. She's a researcher, an eminent researcher at Stanford, and she has identified a handful of different influences on our level of what she calls interdependence. Interdependence in her framework is pretty close to collectivism in terms of what we're talking about. She talks about region of the world, which we've kind of touched on, the global north versus the global south, east versus west. But it's not just that. Even within the United States, there are variations in individualism and collectivism. I want you to take a second, given that you probably have some awareness of different subcultures within the states, to maybe estimate one or two regions you think is the highest on collectivism. Maybe form a mental image of a region that you think is lower on collectivism. It turns out that southern United States, the Southeast, tends to be pretty dang collectivistic within the spectrum that exists in the United States. The West Coast and the Northeast tend to have much stronger individualistic streaks. It's not just that, though. It's not just about region or the city you grow up in. It's also about elements of your personal identity, including things like gender. So, I want you to quickly brainstorm. Do you think that men or women tend to be more collectivistic on average? Most people have a pretty good intuition about this. It tends to be women. Even race within a country like the United States, the place that your roots might be from, or the kinds of experiences you've had based on the color of your skin, also seem to influence degree of collectivism. And the data here is that white Americans tend to be the most strongly individualistic. People of color tend to be more collectivistic. Class. And we've touched a little bit on this already. In our lecture on socioeconomic status, we talked about how poorer Americans and poorer people in most places in the world have to be more dependent on a tight-knit network to really carry them through hard times. And this can lead to people who focus a little bit more on adjusting to circumstances rather than trying to boldly reshape the world around them. So people from lower SES backgrounds tend to be higher in collectivism and interdependence. Religion even plays a role. Mainline Protestant Christians tend to be uniquely individualistic. So you can compare mainline Protestants to evangelical Christians who tend to be a little bit more collectivistic, Protestants to Catholics who tend to be a little bit more collectivistic, and Christians to non-Christians. So Jewish individuals, Muslim individuals, Buddhist individuals all tend to be a little bit more collectivistic than mainline Protestants. You also see this in terms of the type of organizations you're a part of. So somebody who is in a competitive business environment is likely to espouse more individualistic, independent values than somebody who works in education or a nonprofit or in a service field. And so on and so forth. In some ways, these nuances are actually endless. So I'd like you to take a little bit of an inventory of yourself. So you're going to go down each row and check off each of these identity characteristics that applies to you. Have you spent most of your life in the Western Hemisphere or the Eastern Hemisphere? If you've lived in the United States, have you spent the most time in the Northeast or the South or the West or the Midwest? Race, gender, so on and so forth. And then you're going to tally up in each column the number of check marks you have. And this could be thought of as a really rough approximation of the amount of independent versus interdependent, individualistic versus collectivistic influences you had as you've grown up. So keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the lecture, and this might influence whether or not some of these different themes really resonate with you. Okay, so the East versus West comparison is not sufficient. It misses a lot of nuance. But we have still learned a lot from this classic research, even when it does make comparisons just between a North American country and an East Asian country, for instance. And we're going to do a really whirlwind tour of some of this literature. In particular, we're going to be taking a quick look at some of the research results having to do with how culture influences identity, emotion, and conformity. So some of the same things we've been talking about throughout the rest of the semester. So by now you are all intimately familiar with the Ash line study, and you know that for US college students, folks conform maybe a surprising amount, but not all of the time. So in this setup where you have, the rest of the people in the room who are making an obviously wrong judgment about a perceptual task, you will go along with them and say the wrong answer about 30 to 40% of the time. Not none of the time, but not all of the time. And it turns out, and this probably will not shock you, that a meta-analysis of 133 studies across 17 different countries that varied from highly individualistic to somewhere in the middle to highly collectivistic found that the degree of collectivism in a country positively predicted how much people in that country would conform on the Ash line study task. And this isn't just about conformity, it also has to do with a preference for uniqueness and sticking out. So people in individualistic countries tend to show a stronger liking for unique things, things that are rare and stand out. And one of the ways this has been shown is using a really kind of deceptively simple paradigm. So within a larger study, experimenters would ask participants to write something down on a sheet of paper. And they would have an array of pens for them to choose from. There'd just be kind of a pile that was scattered on the table. And the way that they set this up is that they would have red and green pens. And sometimes red pens would be in the minority, like 2 out of the 7 pens available. And sometimes green pens would be in the minority, so 5 red pens and only 2 green pens available. And they did this with participants who originally came from different countries. And what they found is participants from the more collectivist nations tended to choose the pens that stuck out because their color was in the minority. It's one of only a couple red pens in the pile. People from more collectivistic countries tended to choose the pens that were part of the majority, the ones that seemed to be more typical. So people from more collectivistic countries show a higher degree of conformity. There are also differences in terms of how collectivists and individualists think about their identities. So I want you to imagine for a moment that I've asked you to do an exercise where I've asked you to sum up who you are in 10 or 20 short statements. And there are a lot of valid ways that you could approach this question. You could start out by identifying yourself by some hobbies that you have. Maybe you're very artistic, maybe some personality traits like extroversion, or things that you're proud of, like your ability to crack people up, or your athletic ability. But you might also approach this question by discussing a slightly different facet of who you are. You might describe relationships that you have, like you're a child or a parent. You might describe your nationality. You might talk about membership in smaller groups like the Dickinson baseball team, or even a relational role like being a student. And there's a sort of a key dimension that's distinguishing these two things, right? On the one hand, you could focus more on your individual, very personal traits and interests, or you could focus more on relationships and roles that put you in connection with other people. And it turns out that this is something that differs pretty dramatically between the most individualist and the most collectivist among us. So there was a study that was done by Ma and Schoenemann in 1997, and in particular, they were contrasting American college students, likely to be highly individualistic, and rural Kenyans, presumed to be very collectivistic. Among the rural Kenyans, a full 60% of the "who are you" statements that they made referred to roles and relationships. Almost none of them referred to truly private and individual traits. Now, these numbers aren't adding up to a perfect 100 because there are ways you can describe yourself that are neither of these two categories, right? And then we see that this relationship is flipped on its head for the American college students, who are much more likely to describe themselves in terms of things like being funny or creative or an artist, and less likely to describe themselves in terms of things like being an aunt, a sister, a daughter, right? So conformity and identity might seem like areas that are very logically, very closely connected to individualism and collectivism. These might be the exact areas where you would expect cultural differences to appear. But interdependence versus independence also affects some areas of your psychology that you might think of as more hardwired. Things like emotion. And one of the key differences here is that in collectivistic cultures, other people often play a much bigger role in determining when you feel emotions, what emotions you feel, how you make sense of those emotions, and so on. In other words, for collectivists, there's a much tighter link between emotions and relationships. And some really interesting evidence for this comes from a study by a woman named Batja Mesquita, who's a researcher in the Netherlands. And so the basic paradigm that she conducted was asking people who were living in the Netherlands, including native Dutch, but also people who had immigrated from other countries, for instance, exchange students, to talk about really important emotional moments in their lives. And so this is an excerpt of her asking a man who was originally from Turkey about a time he felt especially accomplished. Here's what he had to say. I was admitted to Turkey's most competitive university. It was the second time that I participated in the national competition, because after the first time, I quit. In this competition, the second time around, he ended in the highest percentile. My extended family did not want me to compete a second time, as this would lower the chances of their own children to get into good programs. There was resentment about me participating, and so my honor was challenged. I was forced to be competitive with the children of my relatives. The fact that I won the competition was important to my mom. It was my mother's pride that she could use my success against lots of people. They asked her if they could see my university ID, and without knowing it, my mom had taken it to show them. So, for me, from my cultural background, this is pretty wild. This is not the way that important events in my life have gone, right? But this is what Batja Mesquita found for lots of people who had immigrated from more collectivistic countries. These important touchstone moments in their lives were heavily embedded in terms of what it meant for close family members and friends, how other people reacted, what other people thought about them. It was a key component of their emotional experience. Whereas for a lot of individualists, emotions are predominantly, maybe not only, but predominantly about the self. So she asked the same question of a man from the Netherlands, and here's what he had to say. I gave my final presentation for my master's in civil engineering. You feel like you've really done it. Yeah, you wonder how you've actually managed to do it. I felt like enormously relieved. Not really excited, but more like, it's finally over. I had set myself this deadline, and it made me feel really good that I made it this time. Afterwards, I went out with some friends and relatives, 7 people. We really didn't talk about my presentation. Yeah, sure, they're friends of mine, so they know this is important to me. So you see that he's mentioning other people. They're not uninvolved in the emotional experience, but they are not a deep part of the meaning of the emotional experience. And these friends and relatives are also not having a profound reaction to his experience, except maybe to congratulate or celebrate with him. All right, so let's try to integrate it all together. We have just learned that individualism involves these hallmark features of emphasizing individual separateness, making free choices, celebrating individuality and uniqueness, and fundamentally seeing people as pretty equal. Whereas collectivism is really about being enmeshed in this network of really tight-knit relationships that involve a lot of obligation and responsibility. These tend to be true of collectivistic cultures, but not necessarily all collectivistic cultures. We've talked about how this manifests in different ways of talking and thinking about identity. We've talked about how this manifests in preference for conformity or preference for things that are unique and help you stick out. And we've talked about how this manifests in terms of feeling emotions that are more deeply embedded in your network of relationships or more about your own personal goals, values, and experiences. So that's all for this mini lecture, but check out our second optional mini lecture if you'd like a slightly different competing view about what it implies to be a member of a collectivist culture.